New York City in the 1930s was a place where beauty and brutality walked side by side, where the skyline glowed like a promise while the streets below told a very different story of hunger, crime, and unshakable human will. I thought I knew New York City, until I discovered the raw, untold chaos of this decade, a time when the glittering lights of Broadway hit a world of bootleg whiskey, ruthless gangsters, and desperate survival that turned ordinary people into legends of resilience, and by the end of this journey, you'll see how the city's darkest days forged the unbreakable spirit that still defines the Big Apple today. The New York skyline in the 1930s stood as a beacon of ambition against a backdrop of despair, its towering structures like the Empire State Building, completed in 1931, piercing the heavens with iron and stone, a symbol of human ingenuity amid economic ruin. Smoke billowed from factory chimneys in Brooklyn and Queens, carrying the acrid smell of coal and industry that mingled with the salty breeze from the Hudson River, while along the East River piers longshoremen hauled crates under a sky streaked with soot. Busy streets teemed with vintage cars, Ford Model As and Chevrolets, honking their way through traffic, while elevated trains rattled overhead on steel tracks, their sparks flashing like fireflies in the dusk as they screeched past tenement windows only a few feet away. People hurried along sidewalks in hats, coats, and long dresses, their faces etched with the weariness of the Great Depression, yet their pace never truly slowed. The city felt tense but alive, a pulsating organism where opportunity and peril coexisted in every shadow. America during the Great Depression was a nation gripped by poverty, with unemployment reaching roughly 25% nationwide and about one-third in New York City itself, banks failing, and families evicted from homes. But New York, with millions of residents crammed into its boroughs, became a microcosm of that struggle, a place where dreams crashed against reality and survival meant navigating a landscape of crime, charity, politics, and chaos. When the stock market crashed in October 1929, the financial heart of the world on Wall Street went from roaring to silent almost overnight, and the echo of that collapse haunted New York for years. In the marble halls of downtown banks, men who had once spoken in confident tones now whispered in panic, their polished shoes tapping nervously on the cold floors as ticker tape piled up like confetti from a celebration that had ended too soon. The Bank of United States, one of the city's largest institutions, failed in 1930 after a devastating run, and news of that closure rippled outward through immigrant neighborhoods whose residents had trusted it with their life savings. Brokers who had once worn silk ties and diamond cufflinks now sold apples on street corners for 5 cents. The fruit sweet sent a cruel irony against the bitter winter wind cutting through their thin overcoats. The financial district, once a symbol of unstoppable progress, became a graveyard of broken fortunes, its canyons of stone and glass reflecting not hope but the hollow stare of men clutching folded newspapers that carried nothing but bad news. By 1932, roughly half of New York's factories were closed, almost a third of the city's workers were unemployed, and over 1 million residents were on some form of relief, stretching the limits of both public aid and private charity. Breadlines formed early in the morning outside churches, missions, and soup kitchens, snaking around blocks as men in threadbare coats shuffled forward with tin cups or chipped bowls, the steam rising from vats of thin soup carrying the smell of onions and diluted broth into the cold air. You could walk past a line under a gray Manhattan sky and hear only the murmur of low conversation, boots scuffing on pavement, the occasional cough, and maybe a priest or volunteer calling out, "Next," as ladles dipped into pots that never seemed full enough. Families, unable to pay rent, were evicted from tenements, their furniture piled haphazardly on sidewalks. Mattresses leaning against lampposts, wooden chairs stacked like bones, a child's doll sitting face down on a crate while landlords changed the locks upstairs. At night, some of those families drifted to improvised shantytowns called Hoovervilles in parks and along the rivers, where they nailed scraps of wood, cardboard, and tin into fragile shelters that flapped in the wind and leaked in the rain, the air thick with the smell of burning trash, wet earth, and unwashed bodies. Central Park, the city's green refuge, was not spared from this transformation. Parts of it became home to the homeless, who built rough huts near the edges of the reservoir or under bridges, their campfires flickering weakly against the cold stone. Along the East River and in forgotten patches of land in all 5 boroughs, clusters of huts appeared, given derisive nicknames but inhabited by people who had once lived ordinary lives, clerks, cobblers, maids, and mechanics now united by poverty. New York, for all its wealth, depended heavily on private charities and religious organizations to house and feed the poor, but by the early 1930s those institutions openly admitted they could not keep up with the avalanche of need, their donation boxes emptier each month while pleas for food and coal filled their mailbags. Letters poured into City Hall as well, where Mayor Jimmy Walker's administration, already tainted by corruption scandals, struggled to respond while trying to maintain the city's image as a global capital. In October 1930, under mounting pressure, Walker created the mayor's official committee for relief of the unemployed and needy, and over the next 2 years the committee raised millions of dollars for food, clothing, and fuel, promising that nearly every cent collected went straight to those in distress. Yet the scale of misery dwarfed even these efforts, and frustration boiled over in the streets. In March 1930, thousands of out-of-work protesters marched towards City Hall as part of an International Unemployment Day demonstration, demanding jobs, relief, and dignity, only to be met by police wielding batons that turned the protest into a brutal clash. Harlem, already suffering from housing discrimination and systemic exclusion from many unions and public work projects, endured especially intense levels of unemployment, with some estimates suggesting over half of residents were without work at the height of the crisis. Tensions there exploded into riots in the mid-1930s, when crowds targeted white-owned businesses in anger at racist policies and economic neglect, causing serious damage, dozens of injuries, and several deaths, while investigations into discrimination yielded little immediate change. Against this backdrop of unrest, the political winds shifted, and when Mayor Walker resigned amid scandal in 1932, Fiorello LaGuardia, fiery, reform-minded, and determined to clean up city government, stepped in with a new style of leadership that promised both honesty and action. LaGuardia's tenure would become synonymous with modern New York. He was a small man with a booming voice who crisscrossed the city, inspected breadlines and public works, and spoke directly to New Yorkers through radio broadcasts that cut through the static of despair. He worked closely with President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal programs, using federal funds to expand relief, build infrastructure, and employ thousands of workers on bridges, parks, roads, and airports, giving many their first steady paychecks in years. The city created a public employment bureau so job seekers no longer had to pay private agencies, halted some evictions of needy families, and added municipal lodging for the homeless, small but meaningful steps that helped prevent total social collapse. Still, the depression lingered, and for every job created there always seemed to be another man or woman waiting in line behind the one who got hired, clutching a worn hat or a briefcase that no longer held any real prospects. In this crucible of scarcity, people searched for solace and escape wherever they could find it, and nowhere was that more evident than in the shadowy, intoxicating world of Prohibition-era nightlife. Prohibition, which had begun nationwide in 1920, cast a long, almost surreal shadow over New York in the early 1930s, transforming the simple act of pouring a drink into a crime and turning saloons into secret kingdoms of risk and reward. On paper, the Volstead Act and the federal agents of the Bureau of Prohibition promised to dry the country out. But in a city like New York, the ban on alcohol did something very different. It drove drinking underground and handed immense power to those bold enough, or ruthless enough, to defy the law. Hidden bars and secret clubs, known as speakeasies, seemed to sprout everywhere. In basements below barbershops, in back rooms of delicatessens, behind false walls in restaurants, above warehouses, and even inside respectable hotels that swore they were dry. Access to these places depended on whispers and codes, a knock on an unmarked door, a peephole sliding open, and a password like "Joe sent me," determining whether you entered or were turned away to the cold street outside. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke curling toward low ceilings, the clink of glasses filled with contraband gin or whiskey smuggled from Canada or distilled in clandestine stills upstate, and the sound of muted jazz bleeding from small bandstands tucked into corners. Some speakeasies were cramped, grim rooms lit by a single bare bulb, where laborers crowded shoulder to shoulder around a makeshift bar, gulping harsh liquor that burned their throats but dulled the pain of unemployment and unpaid bills. Others, especially in Manhattan neighborhoods like Midtown or Harlem, were opulent fantasies disguised as private clubs, where tuxedo-clad waiters served cocktails with names like Bee's Knees or Sidecar to crowds of flappers in beaded dresses and businessmen who had supposedly sworn off vice. In these more glamorous joints, jazz musicians played late into the night, saxophones crooning and trumpets punching through the din, dancers spinning and dipping under colored lights as if the chaos outside did not exist. Places like the Cotton Club in Harlem became emblematic of this era, lavish, segregated venues where black performers dazzled mostly white audiences with music and dance, even as those same audiences ignored the racial inequalities waiting outside the club's doors. Wealthy New Yorkers and out-of-towners sometimes went slumming, traveling uptown to watch shows full of stereotypes, even as the talent on stage, band leaders, singers, tap dancers, quietly revolutionized American music. Behind the glamour, though, lay a vast illegal economy that moved like a dark river beneath the city's streets. Bootleggers used fast trucks, hidden compartments, and even boats hugging the coasts at night to bring in liquor, while bribery flowed to policemen, politicians, and prohibition agents who agreed to look the other way or tip off club owners before raids. Some federal agents did attempt to enforce the law zealously, staging dramatic raids, smashing barrels, and hauling bartenders away in handcuffs, but they were often outnumbered and outmaneuvered by the sheer scale of the operation and the willingness of citizens to lie, hide, or run at the first sign of trouble. By the early 1930s, thousands of New Yorkers depended on this underground world for survival. Bartenders, waiters, musicians, drivers, distillers, lookouts, and couriers who might never have found work otherwise in a paralyzed legal economy. The end of Prohibition in 1933 marked a decisive turning point in the city's social and economic life, even though it did not instantly solve all of its problems. When the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th, legal alcohol flowed again, and bars and restaurants could operate openly without fear of raids, fines, or arrests for simply serving a drink, transforming what had been a criminal enterprise into a regulated, taxable industry. Many New Yorkers celebrated the change with open toasts and public festivities, relishing the chance to raise a glass without subterfuge, while brewers, distillers, and distributors rushed to re-establish legitimate operations that could create jobs and fill government coffers. For organized crime, the loss of bootlegging profits was a serious blow, forcing syndicates to pivot more heavily into gambling, labor racketeering, narcotics, and other ventures, even as law enforcement, emboldened by high-profile prosecutions, increased pressure on major figures. Nightlife did not disappear. It evolved, with some former speakeasies converting into legal nightclubs and taverns that kept their old allure of music and camaraderie while shedding at least part of their association with constant danger. At the same time, the broader economy slowly began to stabilize under the combined influence of New Deal programs and the natural cycle of recovery, though full prosperity was still years away and would only truly arrive with the industrial surge of the Second World War. Relief rolls remained high, but fewer people were dropping into destitution with each passing year, and public works projects created visible proof that government was doing more than just sending checks. It was reshaping the city in concrete, steel, and landscaped earth. LaGuardia's administration pushed reforms in policing, transit, housing, and budgeting, laying groundwork for a more centralized, modern municipal government that could handle the complexities of a huge urban population. Civic pride, battered but not broken, found new fuel in these developments, as New Yorkers began to see signs that the long nightmare might finally be easing and that the city they loved could emerge stronger, fairer, and more efficient. Through it all, the memory of hunger lines, jobless marches, and shuttered factories lingered, shaping attitudes toward risk, saving, and the role of public institutions for generations to come. Looking back at New York in the 1930s, what emerges is a portrait of a city of extremes, where crime and corruption flourished alongside compassion and creativity, and where glittering skyscrapers stood over shantytowns with roofs of scrap metal and cardboard. It was a decade in which organized crime bosses wielded real power yet ultimately faced determined prosecutors, in which politicians fell in disgrace but were replaced by leaders who sought reform, and in which ordinary people endured unprecedented hardship yet built communities, art, and traditions that would define urban American life. The jazz songs that drifted out of Harlem windows, the murals painted on public building walls, the newsboys calling headlines at dawn, and the construction workers tightening bolts hundreds of feet in the air were all part of the same story, a collective refusal to surrender to despair. The unbreakable spirit for which New York is famous today, its pride, its toughness, its sense that anything is possible if you keep moving, was forged in these years of scarcity, danger, and relentless change, hammered into shape by forces that could have destroyed it but instead made it stronger. If the city's darkest days revealed how vulnerable even a mighty metropolis could be, they also proved that the human capacity for resilience, reinvention, and solidarity is even greater, and it is that legacy that still glows behind the lights of the modern skyline every single night. If this deep dive into 1930s New York captivated you, hit subscribe to explore more historical eras. See you next time.